Okay, so we can start. David, the first question that I want to ask, could you please introduce yourself, your first name, last name, position, and name of organization?
My name is David Fazio. So my organization is called Helix Opportunity, and I'm the founder and owner and principal consultant of the organization.
Could you please tell us about your career way? How did you choose your profession and what does you attract in it?
Yes, so I think like most people in my industry, it's a personal, I have a personal experience with, so my organization is a social enterprise. So we are a for-profit company. And what we do is we work with government agencies, private corporations, not just to facilitate disability inclusion, like not just to hire people with disabilities, but also to create environments, products, and services that don't just that aren't just usable by people with disabilities, but that include our needs and provide a better quality of life for us, that allow us to enjoy life better, which is a big difference between accessibility and universal design and what my organization does. My organization focuses on providing meaningful experiences, whether it's a meaningful experience in employment or a meaningful experience in using a product, a service, or having quality of life. And we want to do this in a way that doesn't put a spotlight on people that are different. Like I have dysfunctional disability, so I'm different from everybody else. We want to do it in a way that blends people's needs so that you don't have to use things differently and say, hey, this is because I'm different. How I came to this is because when I was 13 years old, August 2nd, 1996, I had a hemorrhagic stroke. The right side of my brain had a brain aneurysm, which is just a swelling of an artery, and it exploded or ruptured into a softball-sized hemorrhagic stroke. So all of that was bleeding on my brain. And what it did is, I should be dead. It completely paralyzed me in the entire left half of my body. It destroyed the vision on the left half of each of my eyes. It left me with severe cognitive disabilities and stuff like that. And this happened when I woke up, and so I went through about 4 years worth of physical rehabilitation. I had just started high school when I got out of rehabilitation. And when I was a junior in high school, I was approached by, well, actually before that, they put me in these classes for people with learning disabilities after I started to recover when I was in high school because I had a brain injury. And while I was in these classes, my teachers wanted to use me as a role model for other younger people or other people that had disabilities on what they could achieve and like how to focus in life and not go down a path that was self-destructive and things like that. So that kind of sort of first started getting me interested in disability related kind of services. And then when I was a junior in high school, I found out about something called vocational rehabilitation. So this goes to one of your questions later on, but there's agencies in every state of the US called a vocational rehabilitation agency. Their job is to work with people with disabilities. Their job is to work with people with disabilities to help them define a career path for something called economic self-sufficiency. They look at to provide services that can help people with disabilities earn a living when they become adults, whether it's, being self-employed or working for a company doing specific type of work. And when I found out about that and I found out they would pay for my college, I got into the program, and my vocational rehabilitation counselor, which is the person that supports your case, found out about all of the knowledge that I had about, disability rights laws and things like that. Well, a lot of parents everywhere in the world, not just the United States, but a lot of parents aren't, not just parents, but people with disabilities, they're not aware of all of the resources that are available to them. Resources to help them be successful in life, resources to help them manage their daily life and stuff like that. So my vocational rehabilitation counselor thought it would be a good idea for me to basically be kind of a peer mentor and talk to parents that have children with disabilities and tell them how they can support their child into, graduating high school, moving on into college, and, this whole economic self-sufficiency thing. So these are the very beginnings of what got me interested in it. And then when I was in college, when I was a junior in college, I was hired by the United States Air Force under a disability program, a program that is specifically targeted to hire people with disabilities. So when I got into the Air Force, I started doing something called lean transformation, which is streamlining processes for, in our case, it was aircraft maintenance and stuff like that. And that kind of sort of got me involved in user research, which is a component of my business. But more importantly, I became a union representative. I became a union rep of the American Federation of Government Employees, and I started representing people with disabilities in discrimination cases. So when the government would discriminate against them on the basis of disability, that's when I would come in and I would represent them and help them navigate the legal process. So all of these things put together are what got me interested in starting my company that focuses on employment, user research of people with disabilities, and making products, environments, and services more meaningful to them, which is the lean transformation tie-in. And so that's the beginning of everything. It's a long beginning, sorry.
That's cool. Thank you, David. It's very necessary to find the way to be self-employed and also to share the resources and to help people to understand how it's all organized and can be used in your career. And also the support for families is also necessary. Thank you.
Yeah, one of the interesting things you'll find, at least in my industry, in like digital accessibility and stuff like that, everybody has a unique path to get into it. It's not like a straight path.
Sure, yeah.
No one just wakes up and say, I want to do accessibility. A lot of people had completely different careers, and then one day they see something and then they go, oh, wait, that's what I want to do. It's really interesting.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for your answer so much. And the next question, difficult question. How is the issue of employment of people with disabilities resolving in the United States for today? How it is regulated in law? Is there any financial support for this direction provided by the government, business, or other organization?
Okay, that's a big question. So let's see. Let me follow along on the document real quick. So the situation of people with disabilities in the United States is surprisingly the same as it is everywhere around the world. I've done a lot of research on this with the International Labor Organization, and less than 20% of people with disabilities in the United States have a job. And more importantly than that, the people that do have jobs, the majority of them earn very low wages, and they're not in skilled positions. They're in very entry-level positions that don't require any kind of education at all. Things like janitorial services, cooking things, chopping vegetables and stuff like that. And this is the same everywhere around the world. And this has mostly to do with societal perceptions and attitudes towards disability. But so that's the employment situation. The good news is there's a lot of legislation and a lot of requirements that have been around for a long time, but recently are getting a lot more attention. So to give you an example, what I just mentioned in the earlier question about vocational rehabilitation, that system was started in 1973, I believe, 1973 or 74. The Rehabilitation Act of 1973, I think it was, required every state to have their own vocational rehabilitation agency. And that agency is government funded. It receives a good portion of its funding from the federal government, but the states also contribute to the funding. Here in California, we have the largest one in all the United States. We serve more than 100,000 people with disabilities every year with these services. And like I said, the purpose of vocational rehabilitation is to work with people with disabilities and figure out what services can they provide that will help them get a job. Those services can be paying for college. It could be buying them a professional wardrobe so they can go to a job interview. It could be starting a small business called self-employment like I did. And this is all not a grant, but it's a program where it's debt-free. So even in my case where they funded my company, they don't own any part of my company. It's not an investment. And I also don't have to pay them back any money that they've contributed to my company. It's not considered a grant, but it's also, it's called a program. So, but it is basically like, kind of sort of like a grant, but.
It has some privileges, yeah?
Yeah. Yeah,
Mhm.
and so in terms of, so I guess that covers the financial support also. There is, there is a kind of an income requirement type of thing. Whenever you first apply for services, if you're earning income and you don't need, a lot of help, then of course they're not going to give you things for free. But most people with disabilities, one of the requirements is that when you're in high school and you have a disability, and if it's known by, the by the government and the public school system, they're supposed to contact the rehabilitation agency. And at that point, of course, you're not earning any money because you're still a child, right?
Mhm.
So you automatically meet the income requirements for the services. So, but if you're an adult and you go to pursue the services, if you're employed and you already have income, then of course you'll have to pay for some things and they'll support you for the things you can't pay for. But if you're unemployed when you apply for the services, everything, of course, is free. Now, in terms of,
Yeah.
you have any question?
Mhm. Okay, thank you. Now it became a little bit clearer for us to understand. Yeah, Olga?
And I guess I can talk about some more laws. Of course, we have anti-discrimination laws.
Yeah.
There are no requirements for private companies to have any specific number of people with disabilities employed. However, there is a clause in the Rehabilitation Act called Section 503. Section 503 requires any company that does business with the federal government to have 7% of their workforce be a person with a disability. Now, not just 7% of their total workforce, but 7% of their workforce in every job category. So 7% of engineers, 7% of IT professionals, stuff like that. However, nobody really paid attention to it until the last 5 years. So in the last 5 years, there's been this big push, for people to do this. And, there's only one company that I know of that is a federal contractor that has met that quota. But a lot of companies are trying to do it, and they're making a big deal about it. They're advertising it and stuff like that. So that is good. However, like I said, the overall numbers of employment of people with disabilities still hasn't really moved that much in the last, 20, 30 years. But, there is a lot of...
Seems to be not that very simple to provide 70% of the each job category with people with disabilities.
Did you
So
say, what number did you say?
70?
No, 7.
No. 7. Sorry, 7.
Yeah. Yeah, no,
Thank
70, oh, heck no, 70, yeah, that would be impossible for them. Yeah, so, but there's anti-discrimination laws and stuff like that. So, but yeah, that's the only kind of sort of requirement. And whether or not the federal government enforces that, that's another story. I haven't heard of a case where, so what's supposed to happen is if you don't meet that requirement, you can lose your contract. But I haven't heard of that happening to a company yet, so.
David, you start to tell us about support of employers. Maybe I ask the next question. What kind of support measures exist for employers when they employment people with disabilities in a company?
Okay, so I did mention, I've mentioned several times now this vocational rehabilitation system. They are also supposed to have like a section, a division or a department that works with companies and stuff like that. So they're there as kind of a resource for employers to contact for, I don't know what you call them in your country, but we call it reasonable accommodations. When a person with a disability says that they need help doing their job, like they need special equipment or whatever, we call that a reasonable accommodation. So there are two organizations, there's your local vocational rehabilitation agency that provides some kind of like counseling on that type of stuff. And also if you want to find people for employment, of course they have people with disabilities. Then there's something called the Job Accommodation Network, which is an NGO, a nonprofit organization that's run by a university that specializes in employers can contact them to help determine what an appropriate accommodation would be. However, I would say personally and professionally that obviously none of these organizations are very effective because the employment numbers, are really low, and state and government agencies in general are typically not very effective to begin with, just by nature of the bureaucracy. And the reason is that there's a lot of legislation that you have to follow in order to get services as a person with a disability. So if you are receiving services from a voc rehab agency, vocational rehab, you have to justify your request. If you say you need a screen reader, or if you say you need this technology or this kind of service, the vocational rehabilitation counselor will ask you basically why. Justify this for me, because they have to justify it to their supervisors. So there has to be a coordination with the employer, the individual that needs the assistance, and the agency in order to understand why it's needed. And there's always a disconnect because the employer doesn't know the legislation, doesn't know the laws and the regulations. Neither does the person with the disability, but the counselor has to, kind of sort of, do everything. That's why my company has started a program that facilitates all of this and works with the vocational rehabilitation agency, understands the laws, works with the individual with the disability that's seeking employment to apply those laws of the services that are available to them, and works with the employer to understand what they need to be successful in the workplace. And we package everything in a way that the agency has no other choice but to approve it, right? So there's individual private companies that try to do things like this. And then there's, of course, the government agencies that are supposed to do these things. So those are what's available.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. What kind of sanctions, if any, exist, are applied to companies that don't have employees with disabilities as a member of a company?
That's an interesting question, because sanctions is kind of not a term we use very often in the US. There are, if you mean penalties, which is I think what you mean, the only penalty that exists in the term of sanctions or whatever that would be applicable would be, like I mentioned earlier, with the Section 503 thing. If you don't have 7% of people with disabilities in your employment fields, you can lose a federal contract. Is it going to be automatic? No, the government has to say, oh, hey, look, you violated this, and they have to take action. I've not seen it happen yet. There are, however, penalties for discriminating against people with disabilities. So you can't deny someone a job just because they have a disability. And if you do, you can be sued in court and have to pay, whatever the judge determines is, the harm. And that's all very case-by-case basis. And if, there's been government agencies that have been found to systemically discriminate against people with disabilities. One that comes to mind is the post office about 15 years ago. And it was in the Midwest somewhere. The post office was, what they were doing is they were taking people with disabilities, removing them from their jobs and putting them on something called limited duty. So let's say you have a job carrying mail, but you become disabled and you can no longer carry mail. It's something that your disability doesn't allow. So what they do is they move you from that position into a temporary job, like let's say a secretary job, because that's something that doesn't require you to carry anything, but it's on a temporary basis until they can find a permanent solution. But what they were doing is they were doing that and saying, okay, we put you here temporarily, but we can't find any other jobs for you, so we're just gonna have to fire you. And they were doing that to, a large amount of people with disabilities. That's against the law. That's systemic discrimination. So they had to pay a big fine to all of these people with disabilities that they did that to. So those types of things happen. But in terms of sanctions where, someone doesn't have a certain number of people with disabilities, we don't really have that.
Is there such a problem as the low level of motivation and qualifications of people with disabilities? And if so, what are you doing in order to solve it?
Motivation? Absolutely not. The disability community in the United States is pretty self-aware. We're aware of our rights to employment. In general, we're aware of a good amount of resources available to us. However, navigating those resources is always a problem, but we are aware that they're there. This vocational rehabilitation system is very pervasive. So many people get college education paid for by the government for free, right? So in terms of qualifications, entry-level qualifications are there. And, you know, in terms of like more complicated qualifications, like, you know, master's degrees and real specific like technical expertise and stuff like that, that's more difficult to come by. And the reason why is because if a person with a disability can't get a job to begin with, how are they supposed to get, you know, the experience in that career field? So getting the education is very common, but getting the experience, that's the harder part. But the motivation is there. We're a very motivated community here.
It's really cool. In Russia, we have the problem with motivation of our people with disabilities.
I've seen that in other countries like Latin America and the Caribbean also, and a lot of it has to do with parents and adults basically telling, they don't mean any harm by it, but they have this perspective that a person with a disability has no chance of doing anything in the real world. So they don't want to get their hopes up. They don't want to encourage their child to go and do something when they know the world's going to, you know, slam the door in their face. So they don't do it. They say, hey, just stay home, just don't do anything. And that's the biggest barrier in all of the world to people with disabilities in getting employment, is this perception that a person with a disability will never be independent, not just because they think that they can't do something, but they think society won't accept them. This is very common. I do a lot of work around the world, and I see this everywhere, even in the United States.
Mm-hmm. What about financial support is provided for unemployed people with disabilities? Do they lose this support in case of employment?
Yeah, eventually, yes, but there's a there's a threshold. So we have two systems here in the United States that give monthly payments to people with disabilities. One is called Supplemental Security Income, or SSI for short. The other one is called Social Security Disability, I think it's insurance, SSDI for short. SSDI is available for people like myself, people that have worked in jobs before and they paid taxes into the system, and then they stop working because of a disability or something like that. Then they qualify for SSDI. SSI is available to people with disabilities who have never worked before and are in low income and stuff like that. And they give monthly payments to the people with disabilities in different amounts, depends on the state that you live in. And also it automatically qualifies you for other services, something called Ticket to Work, and you're automatically approved for this vocational rehabilitation stuff. So what happens is once you start to work, you're only allowed to earn a certain amount of dollars every month for like 9 consecutive months. Once you meet that threshold, you lose your monthly check from the government. However, if something happens and you lose your job and you need that check again, you're automatically expedited back into the system and start receiving it over and over again. A lot of people with disabilities don't know that, and it kind of sort of discourages them from taking on entry-level jobs, because a lot of the time the entry-level job doesn't pay them enough to stop receiving their government benefits. It'll put their situation in jeopardy, whether it's low-income housing or other services that they're receiving. So they're reluctant to take these entry-level, you know, not so good jobs and stuff like that. But yes, supports exist. And you could call the vocational rehabilitation system financial support also, because they pay for things. They'll even pay for the purchase of a vehicle for a person with a disability. I mean, the list of services available is endless.
Mm-hmm. Is there a classification of professions for specific forms of disability? What are the most popular professional areas for people with disabilities?
So if a company identified jobs only fitting for people with disabilities, that would most likely be determined discrimination under our laws. So no, there's no specific type of job for people with disabilities. Although there are organizations, NGOs that I don't agree with, but that are formed just to provide people with disabilities employment opportunities. And you know, some of the employment, like I mentioned earlier, the majority of those employment opportunities are things in janitorial services and professions that will never allow them to make enough income to be, independent and self-sufficient. So organizations like that do exist, but the jobs aren't classified just for people with disabilities. In terms of the most popular job for people with disabilities, I would say it's in digital accessibility. Digital accessibility is kind of sort of, what's the word? It's kind of sort of the ideal position for a person with a disability to work in, because digital accessibility, I don't know if you know or not, is basically testing internet applications, ICT, information communication technology, on how usable and accessible it is to people with disabilities. Can we use this? Does it work for us? And stuff like that. And the best way to test that technology is to have a person with a disability doing it. So of course, companies, when they hire for these types of roles, they would prefer to hire a person with a disability. And people with disabilities would enjoy this type of work because it affects their livelihood and their community, and it's something that they can kind of sort of learn quickly because it's something they experience on a pretty daily basis. So digital accessibility is probably the most popular.
You would like to precise and pose her a question about is it right to understand that the company specifically prepare and implement a position for people with disability in order to test some programs within the company? And if yes, so how many companies exist?
Have such
like
position
Can
inside
you repeat that one more time, please?
the
accessibility of companies.
Right. So so she's asking about what I was talking about accessibility, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah. So typically what happens is companies want their web pages and their digital applications to be accessible. Not only is it the law in a lot of countries, but also they want people with disabilities as customers. So what they'll do is they'll hire people with disabilities, or they'll contract out to companies that have people with disabilities to test their websites. So to go through them and test them to see if it works compared to the digital accessibility standards that it's called the WCAG, WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. I'm an invited expert to the organization that develops these guidelines, and it's called the W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium. They're the organization that develops these guidelines. And so what these companies do is they utilize people with disabilities to manually test their smartphone applications, their tablet applications, and stuff like that, to make sure that they comply with these guidelines and to make sure that they're usable. So they'll contract out to organizations, or they'll hire people with disabilities specifically for their accessibility teams. And they'll do this on a continuous basis because, of course, applications and websites update almost daily, right? And they're coming out with new content and stuff like that. So the position of digital accessibility wasn't created just for people with disabilities. People without disabilities have these jobs also, but they strongly encourage, prefer, and accept people with disabilities to do these jobs because it makes more sense and it's more effective that way. Did I answer her question?
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you. We just start to move in this way, and we have not so many companies that use this service, which attract people with disabilities to check the services of companies on accessibility.
One of the issues,
So it's interesting.
So like I said, I'm an invited expert to the organization that creates the standards. And one of the issues that we recognize is that originally the standards are written in English and they've been translated to a couple of different languages, but that's kind of an issue that we have, is getting the standards translated into languages all over the world so that different countries can understand it better and understand how to implement it. But yes, it's pretty widely accepted around the world, these standards.
Mm-hmm. So about our question, the next one, I want to ask about the labor market. It seems to create consistently new, unusual jobs, which are often called a dream job. For example, an island caretaker or a sofa tester. Do you remember some cases where a person with disabilities has got such an unusual job place?
Not specifically to anything like that, no, but I will say this, back to the accessibility situation. So you have accessibility and then you have user experience, okay? Accessibility means that a person with a disability can use something. It works, right? It functions. User experience means that we enjoy using it. As a customer, we want to use it and it meets our expectations. So there's a lot of contract work available to people with disabilities for user experience research or usability testing. So this is different than accessibility testing. It's similar, but different. So what they'll do is they'll come in and they'll test products, they'll use products, not necessarily sitting on sofas or anything like that. Usually it's digital products like a mobile food ordering application and stuff like that. And they'll get paid anywhere from $50 to $100 an hour, depending on the company or whatever, for this type of research. And to them, of course, it's extra money. It is kind of sort of, it's not necessarily a dream job, but it's something along those lines. It's easy for them to do. It's just for people with disabilities. It's a lot of times it's targeted to people with disabilities, and it's very appealing to them because it's a good hourly rate. Very good hourly rate for anybody, whether you have a disability or not. And it's easy work. All it is opinion.
Mm-hmm. Russia is currently actively developing such direction as social entrepreneurship. Do you know any successful examples of social entrepreneurship involving people with disabilities in the United States?
That would be me.
Yeah, you already told about it. Can you tell us more details? How do you involve in people with disabilities in this work?
So since my work is centered on inclusive design and inclusion in the workplace, the people that I work with to facilitate this are usually people with disabilities. I contract with people with disabilities in the community and all over the world to test products, to do accessibility testing, to do user research, to do employment services, and so it is my core market. So, but there is so there's a stipulation to these services and stuff like that I was talking about with the vocational rehabilitation agencies. So if you have, I think it is 20% of your company or more as a person with a disability, employees with disabilities, you're not considered, it's not considered inclusive. So the mandate of these vocational rehabilitation agencies is to employ people with disabilities in inclusive work environments, right? If you have more than something like 20% of people with disabilities in your workforce, you're considered to be kind of sort of like a special employer, like you're employing just people with disabilities. You're supposed to have a majority of people without disabilities to be inclusive, right? Does that make sense?
Sometimes we have misunderstanding in Russia how to refer a company to social entrepreneurship. Yeah, and sometimes companies that declare themselves as a social entrepreneurship not always correspond to they correspond to requests of this term, but still there are some misunderstanding because this type of social entrepreneurship is only implementing in our legislation, and we're making the first steps literally in this area.
Yeah, and so the point I was trying to make is that if you have if the majority of your company is people with disabilities, you're not really considered a social a social entrepreneur or company, or you're not considered. You're considered more like there's NGOs where their job is to employ people with disabilities and stuff like that. That's a specialized employer type of thing, right? It's not inclusive. It's not bringing in people with and without disabilities and meshing them together. That's kind of the point I'm trying to make. So, so the social entrepreneurship definition for us is basically a for-profit company that makes them a business doing good, you know. So in my case, and that's also a requirement of the program that I'm in. So in order to qualify for self-employment with the vocational rehabilitation system, you cannot be an NGO. You cannot be starting a nonprofit business, and it cannot be anything of that nature. You have to be a for-profit company that, you know, is going to do whatever you want to do. So that's the requirement to get this funding and to be in these kinds of programs.
Mm-hmm. Okay. The next question. If you could compare the situation with employment now and 10 years ago, would you see any differences, and what are they?
Yes and no. It might be because my involvement in industries has changed over the last 10. Oh, yeah. So I see a lot more excitement and visibility around it. In terms of numbers, I have not seen any changes. You know, like I said, this 20% number, it's been around for many years, decades even. So the numbers haven't really changed, but the dialogue and the excitement, the encouragement and the visibility of it has changed, and it's escalated. So there's a lot more talk about inclusive employment and people with disabilities and stuff like that. So that's a positive thing. We just need to work on these, you know, society perceptions about what a person with a disability can accomplish, and, you know, what sort of entry-level requirements they need to be given that chance.
Mm-hmm. And how do you think, what are the three most important components that are not implemented for now, but could solve successfully the problem of employment of people with disabilities?
Job experience. So what people with disabilities really need is at least internships, if nothing else, at a very early age, because a lot of what I've encountered a lot in terms of placing people with disabilities in jobs is it doesn't matter who the employer is, whether they're large or small, they always want to know, you know, what experience do they have? Education is great, but people want experience, hands-on experience, that this person has done this job for, you know, X amount of years, whatever, so that they have a confidence that whenever they hire them, they don't need much training. That's really difficult to come by. And one of the reasons is because this vocational rehabilitation system, their legal requirement is only to provide enough services so that a person with a disability can get an entry-level job. Okay, so that basically means that we only have to provide services so that they can get education, so that they can get a first step job. And that doesn't happen very often. So what happens is we end up having people with disabilities that have got, you know, all this education, they've got bachelor's degrees or they've got certifications and this and that, but they've never worked for anybody because nobody's ever given them that first chance. So getting that entry level, you know, experience is very important, and it's very difficult to come by these days. That's the most important thing, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Okay, do you know about the experience in this field of our countries? Do we have any successful practices that you don't have yet?
I have not heard of anything other than the Olympics was a good success story. I heard that, you know, Russia did a great deal of physical accessibility. So I heard that Russia got a lot of praise for that. I saw some YouTube videos and stuff like that. I would recommend that if you have some things that you want to highlight, to, you know, start doing a lot of social media, LinkedIn especially, YouTube, stuff like that, posting videos so that, you know, you can get visibility, you know, in other places that you'd like to know about what you're doing. There's several conferences that I could recommend also for different kinds of achievements that you feel are worth highlighting.
Okay, and the final question about the new reality. New reality dictates new conditions. More and more projects are globalizing and moving to virtual reality. Which of the projects implemented by your organization could become international?
So one of the things that my company launched is an online learning management system. So we provide education on the internet through a system that is fully accessible to people with disabilities. And it's been designed with all of these best practices for accessibility, inclusion, meaningful experiences, and stuff like that. And it's a software as a service that we're scaling globally that we just launched. So that is probably the most important thing. One of the biggest issues in educating people with disabilities is inaccessible, is systems that were designed that are very inaccessible cognitively, mobility wise and vision and stuff like that as well. So we designed the system to be fully usable by everybody and in a way that's fun, interactive, and engaging, and also enhances the ability to learn. So plus our employment program is global. So we don't just staff people with disabilities in the United States or in California, but we also do it in other countries around the world as well. And we're always looking to create new relationships with organizations that have qualified people with disabilities, like let's say in Russia or in Germany or in Japan, so that when we have a global employer that wants to hire someone with a disability in that region, we can recommend them.
Mm-hmm. So we finished with our base questions. Thank you so much for your time. It was a long interview, and I hope that you're not tired.
No, I'm good. Thank you. This is exciting. I'm glad we were able to connect, and I like, what you're doing, and hopefully I can see you in Moscow sometime.
Yeah, we hope so too.